Good morning, Inspector Young. This is Graham.
Thank you. Good morning, Inspector.
Morning.
Yesterday we had turned to the 2013 manual, which you recognised as the one that you'd dealt with from the 1st of September 2013. It was PS 10938, and I think we'd got to page 6 of that manual. Now, is it fair to say that when the Chair comes to look at and consider this manual in more detail, he can obviously read the content himself, but I'd like to ask you one or two questions in relation to some of the topics.
Of course.
So we're starting back on page 6, please, and this was tactical communication. And you gave evidence yesterday about tactical communication, and you explained the distinctions between that and de-escalation. Well, I think we're getting closer. No, all right. It doesn't like the mornings, the system. What we'll do is perhaps just allow some attempts to fix that. While we're doing that, I'll move on. We can come back to that. I wonder if it would be possible to get something else on the screen. Patience, Miss Graham Patience, we looked at his statement yesterday, and it was SBPI 00385, and I'm interested in paragraph 39. And I think yesterday you explained that you were confident that the probationers would receive training in terms of the content of the manual. You weren't actually able to say how each individual trainer would do refresher training on the manual.
That's correct.
And yesterday we went over the evidence that the Chair has from Shaw and Crawford and Patience to look at how they taught specific refresher training. So let's go back briefly to PC Patience. Paragraph 39, he talks about an earlier statement, and he says, I personally would read the OST manual word for word, so I was sure not to miss anything. I'm asked if this was an individual preference or a general practice amongst instructors during recertification in 2014-2015. Certainly it was an individual preference for me. There's a lot to remember. The manual at the time was enormous, so you can't expect to remember absolutely every detail. Again, it's an important thing you're doing there, so I would tend to have the manual in front of me and read through, just so I wasn't missing anything in particular. I thought it was quite important. And does that appear to be certainly an example of an individual preference from Graham Patience to actually read out sections of the manual?
Yes, and I did see that replicated at times in other venues, yes.
Right. And was that with other trainers?
Yes.
So more than one trainer would use the manual as not just as a source document, but actually to read from when they're doing recertification.
From my experience, yes.
Thank you. And then you also mentioned yesterday that there were PowerPoints. I wonder if we could look at those. We'll see, I have two versions of a PowerPoint, I understand, is from 2013. One's in colour and one's black and white. I'll show you the colour one. And that is PS 17208. And I think you've been shown these before and you've recognised them.
Yes.
So if we move down the page slightly, you'll see that there are a number of slides on this PowerPoint. Now, yesterday, am I correct in saying you said they were used as a technique to train at refresher and perhaps to probationers?
Not a refresher.
Not a refresher.
Yeah, the probationers would receive an OST theory input, where they would receive a theory lesson prior to the practical element.
So when we look at this PowerPoint, is that an example of the PowerPoint presentation that would be given to probationers in around 2013?
Yes, that's the pre-Police Scotland version, yes.
So that's prior to them becoming Police Scotland on the 1st of April 2013?
Round about that time.
Could we look at the first page again, please? It does say Police Scotland there.
So obviously that's been changed then. I think we changed the format to make it, so if you look at the graphics, that's the Scottish Police College graphics and their logos, etc. We changed the PowerPoint to make it consistent with the Police Scotland corporate graphics.
So would this have been the version being
Round
used
about 2013, obviously, if it says
when
Police Scotland.
Yes, they were coming into force.
Yes.
So some of the formatting would have been changed from the pre-1st April 2013
Yes.
position. Right, thank you. And in terms of this PowerPoint, did instructors use it in the normal way, stand in front of the group and use it as a means to go through what is effectively the content of the 2013 manual?
Yes.
So really, the slides that the chair will see on this PowerPoint reflect the content in an abbreviated way that was being highlighted in the training to probationers.
Yes.
Thank you. So let's look at page. Well, let's go through a few of these pages. You'll see at can we see the date at the bottom of that top page? It's just at the very bottom, yes. It says 24/7/2013. So would this have been a version in use in the July 2013?
That's the date it would have been finalised and published, yes.
Right. Does PB mean published?
No, that's the author.
Oh, I see, sorry. And let's move on and look through the next. So it sets out the aims and outcomes that are sought. Keep going, please. We'll go through this quite quickly. Yesterday we looked at the Human Rights Act, Article 2, and then it begins use of force, and the sort of fundamentals are there on the screen. So we talked yesterday about reasonable, necessity, minimum, proportionate. We talked about plain.
Yes.
Keep going, please. And the criteria for use of force, again, we looked at that yesterday in the actual manual. Justification and preclusion. So the probationers would have their copy of the 2013 manual and they would have a PowerPoint presentation from an instructor.
Yes.
Keep going, please. And then we move on here to tactical communications. And again, can I confirm some of this information is extracted from the 2013 manual
Yes.
and used as a teaching tool.
Teaching aid, yes.
And it gives some information about do not underestimate the visual impact of your appearance and body language. And it explains that only 20% of information is taken in through your ears. And they talk about words, intonation and volume.
Yes.
And again, those topics will have been discussed in the class and addressed in training.
Yes.
Thank you. And move on, please. And then I think yesterday you talked to us about the 5-step positive style of tactical communications. Again, there's a more detailed explanation of that in the manual.
Yes.
But this sets out the 5 essential sort of points. And would an instructor have used both the PowerPoint and then the manual as set itself to explain each of these 5 points to probationers?
Yes, the probationers would have the manual in front of them during the theory input, and it would be they'd be referred to the more context, the more information that's contained within the manual. Yes.
So for an instructor like Graham Patience, he would have had the PowerPoint presentation to speak to. He would have been reading things from his manual, and the probationers would themselves have had copies of the manual in front of them.
No, I wouldn't imagine Graham Patience would, because Graham Patience wasn't an instructor at the Scottish Police College. He only, as far as I remember, only did the refresher training at Division,
All right,
where they
sorry.
didn't utilise the PowerPoint.
I was confused there. So
Sorry.
we've been talking about probationer training with the
Yeah.
PowerPoint
Yes.
and them having the manual.
Yes,
And the trainer would have the manual as well.
yes,
But Graham Patience would be doing the refresher training separately. And we looked at his statement where he said he read out from the manual.
Yes.
Would he have had a PowerPoint or not for refresher?
I would, unless he has made his own way, you know, his own methods to get it, then no.
So this would only have been applicable for the probationers.
Yes, he would have received it during his instructor course, but he wouldn't have access to it or utilised it during annual refresher training.
Is this the type of PowerPoint presentation that would have been given to potential instructors in their training course?
Yes, it was more detailed, obviously, but it followed roughly the same format, yes.
Thank you. And keep going, please, and further down. So again, there's more detail about tactical communications. Again, it says for gaining compliance, and I think yesterday you spoke about that emphasis on compliance in relation to tactical communications. Keep going, please. And then it talks about threat assessment and risk categories, and there is no such thing as a low risk.
Not in officer safety training, no.
Next slide, please. And keep going. And then there is a slide in relation to warning signs. Yesterday you spoke about the lists of warning signs, danger signs, and impact factors. And so do we also see, if we move on to the next slide, that has been lifted from the manual, and warning signs and danger signs are discussed on the PowerPoint. And I think the next slide, please, deals with impact factors.
Yes.
And if the chair wishes to look at that in more detail, he can go through the 2013 manual.
Yes,
And essentially those main points are being lifted from that.
that's correct.
Now, as I understand the refresher training, it was updating already experienced and skilled serving police officers, but in the same principles that come from the 2013 manual.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask you about some other matters? You said in paragraph 29 of your own statement to the inquiry, my own personal view is that the training delivered to officers in communication skills, conflict resolution and de-escalation can still be greatly improved. And I wondered if you could share those thoughts with the chair today. You talked yesterday about the regularity of training. I asked you about whether annual was the best. You talked about scenario training. I wonder if there's anything else you'd like to share with the chair about what improvements you think could be achieved with training.
I think the background of this, as I've previously mentioned, is that our training has been very heavily focused on the technical aspect, the technique side of officer safety training, and in my view that needed to be balanced by providing officers with better training in conflict resolution skills and de-escalation skills. If you only teach or train an officer to use physical skills, then because that's all you train them in, then that's probably what they will resort to. We relied on officers' own interpersonal skills, communication skills, and officers have that to varying degrees. Some are very good at it, others not so good at it. But if you only teach officers one particular set of skills, then it would come to pass that that's what they would resort to. I say I did an awful lot of research, spoke to colleagues across the world, and looked at what the scientific papers were saying, and it was all heading down towards that officers needed enhanced and improved conflict resolution and de-escalation skills. We're meeting different challenges in our communities, and we need to be better prepared for that. So my view was that officers required, for me, standalone training that would complement the physical skills in conflict resolution and de-escalation. And in my view, as I suppose as I alluded to yesterday, the most effective way to deliver that training is through scenario-based training, giving officers the theory behind de-escalation, giving officers the tools round about conflict resolution, and then allowing them to practice that in a practical scenario type environment. You'll see now that I believe the College of Policing are moving heavily towards scenario-based training for conflict resolution skills. You'll see a massive push in the places like the US and Australia, etc., for that type of training. And we need to enhance our softer skills to minimise our resort to use of force where possible.
What is the... You've given some explanations in your statement about the attitude to training, and we will come on to that again today when we look at your review. And some of those attitudes have been less than positive, let's say. Do you find that if it's scenario-based training, that officers engage to a greater extent or enjoy it more?
When we introduced basic scenario training in 2016, the vast majority of the results I received were positive with regards to that, and the officers enjoyed it. But we did get pushback in respect that officers, or many officers during the evaluation, they didn't particularly like acting out scenarios in front of their peers, and I think that's a common theme in many organisations or professions. But I think the overwhelming majority, in my view, they preferred that type of training. Maybe because it was something new, it was something that hadn't been done previously. Officers had been used to coming for many, many years and getting the same training year in, year out. It became stale. So there was a mixed feelings, but from what the data that we had, it was more positive than negative.
And in terms of the impact it had on their duties and their ability to perform their role in the public after they've left the training environment, did you see any benefits with that?
That's a difficult metric because you have to look extensively at, are we seeing a reduction in use of force? Are we seeing more officers moving towards their conflict resolution skills? Excuse me. Are we seeing maybe a reduction in assaults? Are we seeing a reduction in injuries? And that wasn't something that we got to the bottom of. We started that work because, as you say, that was an important, for me, and a metric that we needed to measure to see if the introduction of scenario-based training had been successful. But what we also have to remember is that it was the scenario-based training I introduced in 2016 was very basic. It was a first step, an incremental process to full role player led scenario-based assessment, scenario-based training. So I suppose the only measure I can have is the feedback from the officers that I received. There wasn't that data work carried out that would have, I suppose, given that given the results that we needed to see.
So when you left the role as head of officer safety training. Was that work in progress at the time you moved on to full-time taser training?
It was work I had commenced, yes, but as I say, it's a very difficult to measure. I suppose it's akin to the absence of crime. If there's an officer on the street, you can't measure that. You can't measure the impact a police officer has, just by their presence, because you can only measure the crimes that occur. You can't measure the crimes that don't occur. So it's similar to that. We don't know if an officer who's taken what they've learned during that scenario-based training and don't use force, then we can't measure that, if that makes sense.
Yes. And yesterday I think you said each individual officer is different, with different skills, different interests as well, I imagine. Without that anecdotal response, it must be difficult to tell what type of person they are. And
as is a common theme throughout officer safety training, use of force training, is that each officer perceives risk, threat and risk differently, and will potentially act in a different manner to their colleagues, depending on how they react to that stressful incident or that violent incident. So yeah, it's very hard to measure.
I think yesterday when we were looking at the manual, there was a paragraph that indicated you can have two different officers with two different responses. They can still be reasonable, but they will perceive things differently.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Could we maybe briefly go back to the PowerPoint presentation we were looking at a moment ago, PS 17208, and I'm interested in, we've gone back to the beginning, if we can move down to the slides. It says positional asphyxia. Sorry, I've not got numbers on this. It's after edged weapons. Keep going, please. It's the next one. Thank you. So this is the start of the PowerPoint in relation to positional asphyxia. And as we were going to look at the manual and look at the details in positional asphyxia, we'll have to leave that for the chair's benefit. But can we move on, please, to the 3 on, please? And we should see a slide headed Excited Delirium. And there seem to be a number of slides on positional asphyxia. Is that a reflection of the detail and the time that will be spent with probationers on that topic?
Yes, it's reflective as well of the importance, yes.
Yeah. And again, with Excited Delirium, we discussed that yesterday. That's the first slide. There's another slide in relation to that. Was that also given some prominence in the training for probationers?
Yes.
And this was in 2013, and we briefly touched on this yesterday. Were you aware that there had been recommendations in England and Wales? We may hear further evidence about this next year, in the consequence of a death of a man called Roger Sylvester in 2004, where in relation to the death of a black man who'd been restrained and died, restrained by the Met Police, that there had been recommendations that the terms positional asphyxia and excited delirium should be abandoned. Were you aware of that at the time? No. And were you aware that that same review after the death of Mr. Sylvester had indicated that all officers should be continuously monitoring if they were involved in a restraint?
I'm not aware of that particular case. 2004 was well before I became involved in this area of business.
Right. And equally, you wouldn't know that they'd recommended an urgent review about dealing with vulnerable people, people with mental health issues or that type of
I mean, I read a number of reviews and a number of papers, but I don't recall that particular one.
Thank you. So, in the 2013 manual, I think yesterday you said there wasn't as much emphasis on, well, they still had excited delirium. We can see that in the PowerPoint. Positional asphyxia was taught in the same way. And there hadn't been the emphasis on dealing with people with mental health problems or drinking drugs intoxication. Can I ask you to clarify one thing? And if we look at your statement, it relates back to yesterday's evidence you gave about cut.
Yes.
Could we look at your statement, which is SBPI 00153, and that's last year's statement.
Okay.
And if we can look at paragraph 63, and this is under the topic for last year, training in relation to knife incidents. And I'm asked what training officers would have had in 2014-15 on responding to a person in possession of a knife. Then we used to train officers, and there's a variation of it now, in what we call the cut principle. We heard about that yesterday. So if you're presented with a subject in possession of a knife, then you would carry out what we call the cut principles, which is create distance, use cover, and then transmit. And then you mention adopt a tactical option. I think that's the new version, CUTT.
Yes.
The extra T was added by you to reflect what happens next.
Yes.
The way I saw the majority of that trained was not really to approach someone in possession or suspected of being in possession of a knife. We did talk about contact and cover and reaction gaps to make sure that you stay a safe distance away. We talked about where to position themselves so that if that person does come towards them, they're able to react. They maintain a safe distance. Then we talked about knife defence as well. So back then we were taught about how to strike out the police's shoe baton to try and knock the knife out the person's hand, or to try and at least keep them back to a safe distance. So that's what they were taught in relation to dealing with someone with a knife. But the contact and cover principles, the principles of maintaining a reaction gap, they can be applied to any situation, and it would have been appropriate to apply in a situation if you suspect someone's got a knife. I can't remember it being taught in a manner of how to approach someone safely who you suspect may be in possession of a knife. So that was your paragraph last year. Can I ask you to look at your most up-to-date inquiry statement, if we can get that on the screen? And this should be dated 12th July 2023, and it's SBPI 00362. And if we can look at paragraph 14, and in this inquiry statement, from this year, you see, however, what was in the manual could be at times in conflict with what was actually being taught by instructors. By way of example, I experienced some instructors telling students that the best way to deal with someone who is in possession of a weapon or a knife is to physically control them, because that way they can't hurt you. This approach goes against the training ethos of CUT. We taught in 2015 officers who are faced with a knife to, where appropriate, create distance, use cover, and transmit. Immediately going in to physically control someone with a knife puts the officer at grave risk of injury. In the early days of my police career, I recall that training given in relation to knife incidents had a strong emphasis on gaining physical control. I continued to see this type outdated training being delivered intermittently during my quality assurance visits. Teaching officers to attempt to physically control persons with a knife is problematic, as inevitably some will use it and potentially get seriously injured. There is not enough time in the programme to teach officers to effectively use this tactic and become totally competent at it. Now, you gave evidence about cut and the different emphasis yesterday, but just to be absolutely clear, in terms of last year's statement and this year's statement, can you explain exactly what you mean, please?
So in my previous statement, I was simply asked round about the cut principle. I believe this one I was asked, sorry, actually I can't remember. But what I was trying to explain there, I suppose, was that whilst the cut principle is the principle that was taught and has been taught for many years, when I first took over 2014 and doing quality assurance visits, I was still seeing at times the instructors teaching the cut principle, but also saying there is another way that this can be dealt with. So they were straying out with the curriculum as such. And I just wanted to clarify that in that statement, that we're still seeing it. Because depending on the circumstances, depending on the stress level of the officer, the assessment of threat and risk and all the impact factors, etc., officers may still decide that's their call to make that decision and justify that decision if they decide that the best course of action is if they can't visually see the knife, then they make that decision to go in and physically control that person so that person can't access the knife, and that's their call.
So in the past, there was very much an emphasis of taking control and going in if you can't see the knife and getting the job done as quickly as possible. And there may be officers that remembered that and still took that as their default position.
Yeah.
There may have been instructors who still taught that because they liked that approach.
Absolutely.
But the 2013 manual did not take that approach, did not recommend that. As far as you're concerned, instructors shouldn't have been teaching that. They should have been teaching an alternative. But the CUT principle and the CUT CUTT was also a part of that.
Yeah, I think what the instructors were doing were trying to fill the gap, because we didn't teach officers how to properly approach someone with a knife because there was no scenario training. So whilst we did talk about reaction gaps, contacts and cover, you know, one of the examples I saw was when one of the students asked the instructor, and that's when the instructor said, well, this is what you could do.
Thank you. We don't have the manual at the moment, but I'd like to ask you some other questions about the 2013 manual in relation to what it said about diversity. And I noticed, and the chair and those behind me can look at page 28 in due course of the 2013 manual. There is a mention of diversity, a short paragraph, but there's no mention of race or ethnicity in relation to that. Were you aware of any additional training beyond the wording in the manual which covered diversity that would have been included in the OST programme?
I mean, there was additional training, quality and diversity training throughout the force delivered by different departments, but it really didn't form part of the OST programme back then, no.
Right. And the one other topic that I said I would come back to was contact and cover. Now, this was part of Module 2 in the 2013 manual regarding empty hand techniques, and it's page 39 of the manual. I wonder, could you explain what the training was in relation to contact and cover?
So contact and cover was one of the few elements of the course where the officers would actually have to set up and walk through a very, very basic scenario. So contact and cover is the principle whereby you have what we call a contact officer and you have what we call a cover officer.
Can I pause you
Sorry,
there?
of course.
Because I see that we now actually have the manual on the screen. It's page 39 of the manual, which I understand might be page 45 PDF. It might make it easier for you to see that. So. There we are. Contact and cover is on the screen. When two officers are dealing with a subject, they should adopt the contact and cover principle. This enables one officer to take control, whilst the other officer takes up observations from a safe distance. And the contact officer, is that the person who's speaking or is seeking to engage?
Yes.
Is responsible for the communication between the subject and the officers. The cover officer is responsible for ensuring the area around the officers and subject is safe. The contact officer should position themselves with at least a 4 to 6 foot reactionary gap from the subject. The cover officer should position themselves to the side of the subject, at least with the same reactionary gap. They're in an L shape, and if the subject poses a threat, both officers should be in their defensive stance and be prepared to draw PPE equipment. If required, it would be beneficial for one officer to draw their CS with the other drawing their baton. So at the start of this process, they're in a defensive stance. Is that envisaged?
It may be what we call the interview stance. It depends on their assessment of threat and risk from the behaviour of the individual.
What is the interview stance?
The interview stance is basically when your hands are down, round about your belt, midriff area.
Right.
Whereas defensive stance, your hands are up, like that.
We've seen demonstrations
Yeah.
of that. Sorry, and I interrupted you in relation to explaining contact and cover and the bit. Tell us when that would be used.
It could be used for any interaction between an officer and an individual. Again, depending on the threat and risk posed. I mean, if you're just going to take a statement, or if someone's wanting to report a crime or speak to you, you don't automatically have to go into this contact and cover principle. It's mainly used if you have information intelligence that you need to stop and speak to someone. They may be part of a stop and search. It may be part of, when you've located, identified a suspect, whatever it may be. And that the principle is whereby one officer will normally be face on square to the individual. That'll be the contact officer. The cover officer will usually be off either at a 45-degree angle or a 90-degree angle, depending on their assessment of threat and risk. The contact officer will engage the subject, talk to them, whilst the cover officer is responsible for observing the actions of the subject, maintaining a situational awareness of the surrounding area, and basically covering their colleague, and providing that safety for them.
Why are they looking out for situational awareness?
Because a good police officer needs to be aware what's happening around about them at all times.
Are they looking for members of the public that might be approaching?
It could be members of the public. It could be friends of the person they're talking to. It could be anything.
And you mentioned the angle depending on the level of risk, and you've talked about high risk, and I understand there's no such thing as low risk, so unknown risk or high risk. What angle are they at if it's high risk?
It's not as prescriptive as that. For me, I'd be at a 45 or a 90-degree angle if we suspected someone to be high risk.
And what's the benefit of adopting this technique, contact and cover?
The benefit is obviously, first of all, you maintain the reaction gap. So you're at least 4 to 6 feet away from the subject. Actions will always beat reaction. So maintaining that gap in the contact and cover formation allows that additional time to react to any actions of the subject. The contact and cover allows the cover officer to maintain that situational operational safety, and if they're positioned properly, they can even see around the back of the subject at an angle. They're in a position they can concentrate on that subject in the surrounding area. So it's just a safer approach to deal with somebody who may have information intelligence or who you've assessed as higher risk.
Does this allow officers some time to engage in communication or tactical communication with the subject?
Absolutely, and if you maintain that reaction gap, one of the benefits of that, especially if someone's in crisis or someone's agitated, then it allows you to stand off, and it gives them a bit more space, it puts them a bit more at ease, especially with uniforms and the kind of, I suppose, the authoritative nature that the police have got. Being close to some people and getting too close can sometimes increase their agitation.
Any time limits involved in this, or can it last as long as the officers wish?
Absolutely.
The reference there to being in a defensive stance and prepared to draw PPE equipment, is this designed to be used up until the point you think PPE needs to be drawn or potentially used?
I mean, you can do contact and cover whilst utilising your personal protection equipment, so it's not uncommon, and we trained it whereby one officer would have their PAVA drawn and the other would have their batons drawn as a tactical communication while still engaging with the individual.
Thank you. I'd like to move on and ask you some questions about the options that officers might have in a particular scenario, and what training they would have received, either as probationers or as refreshers, which would assist them in assessing what their options were and what the best course of action was. So if, and I appreciate all officers are different, but if we just assume it's a reasonable, hypothetical reasonable officer. So if officers were attending a knife incident and multiple calls were coming in from the public at around 7 in the morning, shortly after 7, and within about 8 minutes there's 6 emergency calls made from different members of the public. So there's not corroboration, but there's a number of independent people saying there's an issue. And they speak of an African-looking male chasing a complainer's car. He may be carrying a knife. He was big with muscles, about 6 foot. He was jumping in front of cars and stopping them. And other calls mentioned a 9-inch blade. These calls are largely graded 1 by the ACR. We've heard evidence that's an immediate threat to life. And the acting police sergeant in charge of the response team who respond to that incident requests all units to respond and requests a dog unit and an ARV. So that's the scenario, and 2 officers are the first to arrive at the scene. There's no other members of the public around at that time, but it is a residential area. There are hospitals nearby. We've heard evidence there's churches nearby. The first officer who alights the vehicle realises that the man, it was, as he put it, high on something. His eyes were bulging out of his head. It was raining and blowing a gale, and the man was wearing a wee t-shirt, as he put it, and he had his palms out and they didn't see a knife. Now, in that scenario, what specific aspects of the training that officers would have had under the 2013 manual, either as refreshers or as probationers, what specific aspects of the training would assist them and help them with choosing options on what to do in that situation?
So the first element of the training would be the training delivered round about risk assessment. So that would be assessing the risk posed by an individual, whether it be the person, any objects or the place. So that's the first thing we always taught, was assess the risk posed by that. Second part would be assessing the risk and ascertaining if that subject had the means, the opportunity or the ability and intent to cause harm, either to themselves or to others. What you're looking, when we talk about means, opportunity, ability, intent, we're looking for that officer to negate at least one of them. So we have to identify as part of the training, and we would expect officers to assess, does that individual have the means to do me or others harm? Do they have the opportunity? Do they have the ability, and what is their intent? Now, intent's very difficult because the intent's a difficult one to establish. The means, as in, are they, do they have anything, do they have a weapon in their possession? Do they have the means to do harm? Opportunity is the main one that police officers, are the easiest one that police officers can negate. And then ability, does someone have the actual physical ability to do harm? So that's the first elements of the training, and then once they assess that risk, it's then they will look at, or they'll be taught to look at, what's the profile offender behaviour. What behaviours is the subject exhibiting that would give them cause for concern, that would assist in their threat and risk assessment. Once they've established that threat and risk assessment, they would look at what options they have available to mitigate that risk posed. Now, we've already talked about contact and cover and reaction gap. For me, that's the first actions that we taught the officers could have utilised in that situation. Because by maintaining that reaction gap, you remove the opportunity of the subject or the individual to do you harm. We talk about reaction gap, so either maintaining or increasing that reaction gap is what was taught that could assist as well. Additionally, they are taught how to use and utilise their personal protective equipment. So it would be their PAVA spray or their batons. It would be up to them at that point to decide, and we go through justification, preclusion, run through the criteria for use of force, what would be a reasonable, necessary and proportionate response to the threat posed. And that's quite a lot, and that has to be done in a very, very short period of time. And in some occasions, other times they have longer to do that. So that's the elements of the training that, in my view, were delivered that would assist in the situation that you've explained.
And thank you, that was helpful. As you went through, you talked about an officer assessing the profiled offender response. In addition, I think you told us yesterday that under the 2013 manual, there was still reference in training to the reasonable officer response. Yeah. And is that something that an officer who'd been trained under the 2013 manual would also be considering as part of his response to the profiled offender behaviour?
Yeah, sorry, when I went on to talk about utilising personal protective equipment, contact and cover, that's all part of your reasonable officer response options.
Right. And moving on from that, if the officers arrive, the scenario is the same as I just described, but in addition, the subject is not shouting, not brandishing a knife, not acting in an aggressive manner at that stage, but essentially says nothing. And the officers shout that they want him to get down or put down the knife. So he just simply does not respond. What sort of training have the officers had under the 2013 manual that would then allow them to consider their options?
That takes back to, for me, that's you then falling into your tactical communications element of the programme. And the only training they'd receive in that is what we've discussed round about the tactical communications element. They may have tried to use the 5-step appeal, They may have tried to think about what their intonation, their language, what was their body language was like. But as I said, because of the absence of scenario-based training back then that's all the training would have had.
So at that point, the tactical communications that we looked at yesterday and which are within the 2013 manual would be the type of training that may assist officers in
Yes.
responding.
Yes.
That would include the 5-step positive
Step,
communications and the things that you discussed yesterday and are in the manual. And can I ask you, if the subject remains non-verbal, he's simply not engaging, what training in 2013 was available to allow officers to rationalise that and consider the risk and process that element?
That wasn't part of the curriculum. So there, as I say, because of the absence of scenario-based training, there was no training to cover that. Apart from their own interpersonal skills and apart from the tactical communications training that I already discussed.
And so, given what you said yesterday, did that then fall back onto their own skills and their own discretion?
Yes.
And yesterday we talked about, or you mentioned in evidence, the possibility of people with disabilities, perhaps deaf, or language communication difficulties, perhaps English isn't their first language. Was there much training on that for officers in the 2013, from the 2013 manual?
No.
So again, did that fall back on their own experiences, their own discretion?
Or any other additional training they may have received from other areas of the business, but not within OST, no.
And as you said yesterday, no scenario training for officers at that time under the 2013 manual.
That's correct, yeah.
And thereafter, if officers elected to use sprays and they had no impact on the subject, and he continued to show no response, apart from at one point perhaps wiping some of the spray from his face, in that scenario for officers where the subject is at that stage non-verbal, the spray has had no impact, what sort of training would prepare officers for responding to that scenario?
So during initial training and refresher training, we did what we call transitional training, which is officers would move between various or other parts of their PPE. So we would have if you had two students, for instance, one would, I wouldn't say play the part, but one would act as an aggressor. And that officer, the officer would say, for instance, draw their spray, and that would be ineffective, and they would have to then transition to another tactical option. Whether that would be their baton, or we would do it the other way, where the colleague would have a pad, they would strike the baton, that would be ineffective, they would then have to disengage. Because that hasn't worked, they would have to transition to another tactical option, whether that be empty hands, whether it be drawing spray. So yeah, that's what I did.
I think yesterday under reference I think to Graham Patience's statement, we talked about a remote rendezvous point, observe, wait, feedback, we talked about de-escalation, we talked about verbal dominance or a hard stop. I think yesterday, as I recall your evidence, you said that there wasn't really any specific training under the 2013 manual in relation to those options, and that would have come from an officer's experience or awareness from their practice, because some of those were more common than others. No
Yes.
doubt. So in relation to withdrawing and disengaging, if no impact, the CS or PAVAD had no impact, what training from the 2013 manual would have existed in relation to the right time to withdraw or disengage completely?
It wasn't covered. We did obviously speak about maintaining that reaction gap, but we didn't discuss during training the concept of contain and negotiate, which may have been an option in the situation that you describe. So that wasn't discussed back then.
Can you help the chair understand, you talked about transitions and training in transitions. How did that differ from saying, here's other options, like remote view, rendezvous point and de-escalation and observe, wait, feedback, that type of thing?
So when we talk about transitional training, transitioning between different tactical options, it was more of a drill than a scenario, if that makes sense. So I think what you described there would be a scenario whereby you give information to the student and they have to come up with a list of actions they would take and act that out. Transitional training is a drill, and it's simple when it was one-on-one, just getting that officer to practice being able to utilise a tactical option that wasn't working, transition to another tactical option. So it wasn't a scenario, it was a drill, if that makes sense.
So again, in terms of for an officer who was facing that situation, they would have to fall back on their own discretion, their own experience, their own skills.
Yes.
No training really in helping an officer work out what to do there.
No.
And what training did they get in relation to giving feedback to ACR?
From
As part of the OST training?
none. Wasn't included.
What training did they get as part of OST training in 2013 about things like specialist resources, so dog units, ARVs, waiting for them, requesting them, who can authorise them, any of that information?
Again, it wasn't included in the OST curriculum. Going back to the feedback in the ACR, asking for specialist resources, I would always mention that when I was delivering the training, that these were always available, and as would other instructors, but as I say, it wasn't part of the curriculum back then, so it was down to the individual instructor whether and to what extent they would talk through that type of situation or those options. There wasn't a standardised, consistent approach.
So was there anything in the 2013 manual about that?
About?
For feeding back to ACR, specialist resources?
Not that I'm aware of.
I should say I haven't found anything,
No,
but...
no. Without going through it again, but as far as my recollection is, then no.
Right. All right. Now, I'd like to move on, please, but before I do, I should perhaps ask you to look at another PowerPoint presentation, PS 18621. Now, this is just to confirm that you recognise this. Is this, am I right in saying this is a later PowerPoint presentation?
Yes.
When did this one date from?
I think this if now it's been referred to as operational safety and not officer safety, that'll be for the new 2016 programme.
Right. So this was the programme that came in later,
Yes.
after you'd been in post
Yes.
for a while. And the chair will be able to look at this at his leisure. Was this used for the same purpose as the PowerPoint we looked at shortly, a moment ago, for training probationers?
So we identified a gap, obviously. The challenge we had was that at most of our facilities that we delivered refresher training to, we didn't have classrooms, we didn't have facilities to deliver a PowerPoint. So we put it onto the Moodle e-learning platform, and it was a mandatory lesson that officers had to go through prior to coming on their refresher. But it was also the PowerPoint that the probationers would get as well.
So this would have been viewed by all of the refresher students as well as the probationers
Yes.
post 2016?
Yes.
Right. So unlike, as I understand from your statement, you didn't introduce pre-reading to the OST training until after the 2016 programme came into play.
When we put in the new programme, we introduced a pre-read, a mandatory pre-read. And again, that was to fill that gap that we couldn't physically deliver it. But I wanted every officer to be refreshed in the theory aspect every year.
Right. And that was something else that was missing in 2013?
Yes.
I'd like to ask you some questions about, yesterday you mentioned your review.
Just before you do that, Ms. Graham, can I just ask a question? Was there any, in relation to the training on the use of sprays, was there any warning given as to the risks of self-contamination with the spray? In other words, getting it on your own face.
Yes, sir. Yeah, that was heavily emphasised, in particular with CS spray. The possibility of cross-contamination for CS spray was far greater than PAVA spray. So that was heavily emphasised during the training, sir, that if you spray that, then most people in the vicinity will get the effects of it, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Graham.
Thank you. So yesterday we talked about when you changed your role at Tullyallen. You'd originally been, I think, a police sergeant trainer.
Yes.
You then became in charge of the probationer training at Tullyallen, and then you moved on to the national coordinator role.
That's correct, yeah.
And I think if we go back to your inquiry statement, paragraph 6, so that is SBPI 00362. Paragraph 6. You say, when I took on the new role, I noticed that while the probationer training was standardised, that since the creation of Police Scotland, with no standardised OST refresher programme across the former legacy forces, and therefore probationers went to force where they had legacy force training that could contradict the training they received at the Scottish Police College. Can you explain that to the Chair?
So I think since 2008, there was a standardised OST initial course that was delivered to all probationary officers when they attended at Tullyallen. As part of their probationary training, once they complete their element at Tullyallen, they would go back to their force for in-force training, which is normally on local procedures, on the differences, because Tullyallen doesn't take into account the local procedures and I suppose the local differences that the legacy forces had. So they had to go back and receive that localised training. As part of that, most forces, I think all actually, would give them an OST refresher as such before they went back out. And that at times differed across the country. The legacy force programmes, so the legacy forces had control of their own OST programmes that they delivered in force, and at times differed various aspects quite significantly from force to force. And then obviously for their officers coming back on the refresher training, even although there was this standardised programme at Tullyallen, the legacy forces had their own in-force OST programmes. In the main, they followed the core of the probationer, the national programme, but there was some significant differences as well. And when I took in the post, when I started doing my review, my quality assurance visits, I noted at times that whilst in the main what was contained within the core programme was consistent across the country, there was still some variances and some disparity in what was being taught. And for me, that was a significant risk.
Can you help the chair? You've talked about significant differences between the OST training in the legacy forces and at Tullyallen. Can you give any examples of those differences to the chair which related to Fife Constabulary?
I mean, my recollection, I can't remember back to exact examples of what I saw different in each individual force area. And I can't recall what I reviewed or what I observed, particularly at Glenrothes. So no, not with the passage of time. I couldn't tell you exactly what differences I saw, and I would be guessing or assuming if I gave a response.
Thank you. And then moving on to paragraph 7, you then say you got involved in the OST practitioners group. Each legacy force came together under the supervision of the Chief Inspector of Tullyallen to decide the content of the refresher programme. You think it was Chief Inspector Stuart Ord at that time. He initially chaired the OST practitioners group and had responsibility for the annual refresher training. However, this was later devolved to an inspector who had no experience of OST. Do you remember who that was?
That was Inspector Jackie Cotterill.
Right. So through this OST practitioners group, it became apparent what was in the refresher programme was contradictory to the probationer OST training programme. A disparity in terms of actually what was trained between the former legacy forces. And you say the refresher training programme lacked quality assurance. What's that?
So quality assurance process is where the content of a training programme is reviewed for its adherence to the documentation and the curriculum and how it should be trained.
And lesson plans, what were they?
So lesson plans are documents that outline the format of a lesson, of a course, and how it should be delivered, timings, content, etc.
And were they in relation to probationer training at Tullyallen?
Yes.
Or did they also relate to refresher courses?
There was no lesson plans for the refresher courses apart from, I think, Legacy Strathclyde.
So we have a number of lesson plans. We can maybe bring one up on screen. PS 11456. We'll come back to paragraph 7 in a moment. And we see this is headed up lesson plan, officer safety training. There's a lesson title. It relates to student officers. Is that probationers?
Yes.
And as we look down the page, we should see on this one, it says at number 3, a list of possible medical implications in relation to the above procedures, including excited delirium and positional asphyxia if applicable. And 4 is apply the techniques with reference to the national decision model, including the use of force. So these are examples. We have 2 or 3 of these. They're examples of the sort of lesson plan given to probationers in the OST programme.
Yes.
But nothing equivalent to this for refreshers.
Not in the previous programme. We brought them in, obviously, for the 2016 programme.
Thank you. Yes, this still relates to the 2013 situation. Let's go back to your inquiry statement, please. We were on paragraph 7, SBPI 00362. So you'd said the refresher training programme lacked quality assurance, lesson plans, and then you say and risk assessments, all of which were present in the probationer OST programme. What were risk assessments relating to?
So a risk assessment is where you look, or you review an activity, you identify the health and safety risks contained within that activity, and then you put measures in place to mitigate.
Did that relate to the actual training itself?
Yes.
There was also lack of governance and quality assurance within the OST refresher training. Tell us about the issues with the refresher training. What was the lack of governance?
From my experience, when I first moved in to a national role, it just appeared...
That was 2014,
Yes,
September 2014.
Yes. It just appeared to me that nobody had an overall management of the OST programme. I suppose, for want of a better phrase, no one had a grip of it at a senior level. It was left to officers at constable rank to decide the content of the programme. And whilst they were very experienced and knowledgeable, there was no scrutiny applied to that by senior management. And in fairness to them, because they didn't have that extensive or that level of knowledge, use of force or officer safety training. So it just appeared that the senior officers who had overall management and responsibility for the OST programme, I don't think had the required knowledge and the skills to properly manage that. And whilst I understand that at a senior management level you have to rely on advisors or subject matter experts to advise you, I just felt it was kind of left, and I don't think it was given the importance that I think it required, and the attention I think it required due to the risk involved in it.
And what were those risks that you were concerned about?
So I'm not talking about the risks involved in training, because to a great measure they could be mitigated. I'm talking about the risk of using force in that operational environment, the risk involved in restraint and control, and using tactical, personal protective equipment. For me, it's a very high risk activity, and I think because it's something that gets used on an hourly, daily basis in policing, I sometimes don't think that the risk is totally appreciated. And in my view, it's a high risk environment.
And high risk to the public?
High risk to the public, yes.
From officers using force?
Yes.
And I think you said in your statement that we've heard Police Scotland came into being on the 1st of April 2013. Was there no work stream in relation to OST training up to the commencement of Police Scotland? No,
there was no, unlike other areas such as firearms, etc., there was no reform work stream for OST, so there was no work done to standardise OST for the introduction of the National Force.
And why was that not done for OST? Do you know?
I couldn't say.
And then once you came into the national role in September 2014, you've said here that there were issues about you felt no one had a grip of it, I think you said. Is that correct?
That was my impression. As I say, I don't, for whatever reason, and whether it's maybe people don't appreciate the risk if they're not involved in that area of business the way I was, it just didn't seem to be given a high priority in my view.
You've said earlier today that you felt that OST could have been improved at that time. If we could look at paragraph 33 of your statement, you were referred to a comment that had been made in a position statement, and you were quoted as, this is a quote from that. It says, as a result of his review of the OST programme and his research in 2014-2015, Inspector Young considered that changes were required to the National OST programme and that the guidance in the OST programme and the manuals was outdated, inadequate and needed to be revised. This was particularly in respect of de-escalation strategies, tactics and conflict management, mental health issues, ABD and dealing with subjects and disabilities. Is that a fair reflection of your views at the time?
Yes.
And did you feel that all of those areas could be improved and should be improved?
Absolutely, yes.
Were you, and you said a moment ago you were concerned about the risks.
Yes.
And you then go on to say in paragraph 33, the manual and OST training programme itself were outdated and inadequate. The OST programme wasn't outdated when it came to the physical intervention techniques, but as far as tactics and tactical skills, such as conflict management and de-escalation were concerned, I think we were lacking. And that's, I think, what you've been telling us this morning.
Yes.
You say, I think we were behind the training of other police forces in the UK. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? And I know you said you did research as part of your review.
When it came to, I suppose, conflict resolution, and the way that was trained, when I visited other forces, they were, I suppose, ahead of us in terms of conflict resolution training, scenario-based training. So, in that respect, yes, I think when I did the review and, you know, I suppose did my benchmarking exercises with other forces to see what good practice was out there, then I would suggest we were slightly behind, yes.
And we may hear evidence next year from Martin Graves about Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, who did a review in 2007, which, as I understand, he will give evidence was quite damning about the training in England and Wales at the time, and that prompted a review which substantially changed a number of the areas that you've highlighted
Yes.
here. Had there been any attempt, as far as you know, to take on board lessons from the situation in England and Wales by the time you came in as national coordinator?
I'm not aware of that, and I'm not aware, I believe potentially maybe 2000, I can't remember the exact date, but I think there was an ACPOS working group established, but I didn't think it went as far as what we were seeing in England and Wales with regards to recommendations. And I never received any, I suppose, direct instruction from the executive or senior management to review our current training. So I don't think there was any, not cognizance, but I don't think it came that we needed to review our training, or nobody told us we had to review our training, if that made sense.
We may hear from Martin Graves next year. He's not given evidence about this aspect, that the Met in particular developed an award-winning video demonstrating how officers could deal with people with mental health issues. You obviously recognise that description.
Yeah.
And he understood that had gone to Strathclyde. Did that ever find its way to you?
Yeah, so I requested a copy of it. I was a member of the UK OST practitioner group, which gave me really good insight into what other forces were doing, what the National Police Chiefs Council, Self-Defence Arrest and Restraint Group, I was a member of that. So, and through my contact with the Met, I got hold of that video, and I submitted a briefing paper asking if we could replicate that, because in my view, we needed to do more to inform the public of, how we control and restrain, why we control and restrain, and the reasons why we do it. Because I think it can be easily sensationalised when you talk about there was 5 officers or 6 officers on one, when the reality is that it's an extremely difficult activity to undertake. It's very, very difficult to restrain someone, and the more numbers you have, the safer it is. And I thought that more needed to be done for us to inform the public of that.
Inform the public as well as train the officers.
As well as train the officers, absolutely.
And as part of your role at that time, so you came into that role September 2014, you quickly realised the difficulties that you've explained here in this paragraph. And as I understand it, you then embarked on a review which commenced on the 1st of December 2014.
Yes.
Now, I think you say in your inquiry statement you weren't actually instructed to do that,
No.
but you volunteered. You felt that was necessary and you wanted to do that review. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes, that's correct, yes.
So, was there any pressure on you or request on you to do this work? Or was it simply something you thought needed done?
It's when I came into post and I was able to obtain a national picture, and that's when I identified the challenges and the issues that needed addressed, which prompted me to propose to my senior management that we needed to urgently review our position with regards to OST.
Once you came into that role, the national role, in September 2014, how long was it before you realised you had an issue here that you wanted to review?
I realised prior to getting into the national role, because whilst I was the OST coordinator at Tully Allen, I was getting introduced to the national picture, and I was seeing then the issues that were in place at that point.
So when your review started on the 1st of December, how long did it take you to get that authority from your senior officer to actually carry out that review?
Instantaneous. It was,
So sometime in November
yeah, I would suggest so, yes.
that you made that request?
I believe so, I couldn't.
And you've talked already about the UK-wide Officer Safety Training Practitioners Group. So as part of your review, as I understand it, you've told us in your statement, you engaged with groups and other bodies.
Yes.
And that was one of them.
Yes.
And they existed at the time you came into the national role.
Yes.
Is that true? And could you help the chair understand what the work they did? Tell us a little bit more about that work.
So they were part of the National Police Chiefs Council, which is obviously relates to England, Wales, Northern Ireland, whereby each chief constable in the UK and Northern Ireland are form a council where they look at various aspects of policing in England, Wales, Northern Ireland. Many of the chief constables will have a national portfolio, whether it be in armed policing or public order or use of force or domestic violence, whatever it may be, local policing, whatever. The National Police Chiefs Council portfolio lead, who is responsible for the training of officers in England and Wales, they have what they call a practitioners group, Self-Defence Arrest and Restraint Group, which is made up of practitioners from a variety of forces who get together regularly and meet and discuss the 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 issues. The meeting discussed the advancements, how training can be enhanced, and the content of the manual of their OS. Or it was called their personal safety training manual at that time, which is published through the College of Policing.
And so there were members of that group covered a number of jurisdictions such as Scotland and England,
Yes,
and you attended for Scotland.
yes,
And did they share updates in relation to officer safety training?
yes.
So was this a group which allowed you to learn lessons and see what the up-to-date research was and that type of
That
thing?
was invaluable. Yes,
Yeah. And was that your attendance there was because of your role as a national coordinator?
yes.
Had there been a member from Scotland on that group prior to you joining?
I believe prior to Police Scotland, there may have been members from time to time from some of the legacy forces. I believe Lothian and Borders had a membership on it. I think Strathclyde, but I don't know how long for they actually partook in the group. Excuse me.
Do you know if anyone from Fife Constabulary had been on that group before Police Scotland came into existence?
I couldn't say. I don't think so.
And I also understand from paragraph 48 to 51 of your statement that you were part of a use of force monitoring group. Is that right? Let's look at, it might be referenced in 48 to 51. Use of force data monitoring, and you start to talk about that. And you'll see that you say, I drafted the terms of reference for that group. The way I envisaged the use of force monitoring group was to monitor the effectiveness of our OST training through data. Was this a new group that was created by you, or was it something that existed before?
No, it was one of the recommendations from my review. We had no national group that would look at OST in its entirety, a group where we could get decisions made at, provide that effective and proper governance through OST. So initially it was started, I proposed this group, it was started as the OST monitoring group, which was chaired by the head of leadership and training. And then thereafter it progressed into the use of force monitoring group being chaired by Assistant Chief Constable.
So this wasn't a group which existed before your review?
No.
This arose out of the recommendations in your review, which we'll come on to later this morning. I'll come on to that later then if it's arisen out of your review. And then, as I understand it, there was also liaison, and you can help me if this was before or after your review, liaison between the NHS and Police Scotland. Now, I'm going to ask you about Dr. Stevenson, who I think you met on that group. Was that group where you linked in with liaised with NHS, was that before your review or after your review?
I think I started looking to engage with partners after the review, so I think that would probably
Right.
be in the preparation for the new programme.
Right. I'll come back to that then. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, actually.
20-minute break at this point. That's great.
Thank you. We were about to start looking at your review, Inspector. So this is PS 11533, and we'll bring that up on the screen now. And on page 1 we'll see that this is entitled the National Officer Safety Training Review and Evaluation Report, and it's dated April 2015. So this was the month before the events on the 3rd of May 2015. And it's your report and review, and you wrote it.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And does this, in essence, encapsulate what you thought about the training at the OST at that time, and made a number of recommendations where you thought improvements could be made?
Yes, it was mainly in relation to, I suppose, policy and procedure. Although there are some references to the content of the programme itself. But as I said, that was always meant to be a kind of incremental process. For me, the main risks at this time was the lack of the standardisation, the lack of policies and procedures. So that's mainly what the review focused on. Although I did obviously consider the content of the programme also.
So on page 3 of this review, you say at the top of the at the introduction, top of that page, this report briefly details the current position nationally of officer safety training. But was this the sort of big issues, the high level issues that you had recognised and identified as part of your review process?
That's correct, yes.
And that was the review that had been conducted between the 1st of December 2014 up to the date of this
Yes.
report. Thank you. And in paragraph 2, you say you're hoping it'll ultimately form a national training strategy and minimum effective standards for OST development and management. And you say this work will propose recommendations that will form the basis and management of a national officer safety training programme.
Yes.
And this is the programme you've mentioned, which was then brought in 2016.
Yes.
That's what this then became at a later stage.
That's correct, yes.
So you mentioned the background briefly. We'll just look at that. OST was first introduced to the Scottish Police Service by Strathclyde Police in 1995, following the death of a PC, Lewis Fulton. And then a training programme was developed after that, and you mentioned the background generally.
Yes.
Can we look at the next page, page 4, please? And you say, as time progressed, a disparity in the way that OST was being delivered across the different legacy forces was identified, and as a result, concerns were raised by the Scottish Police Federation at the ACPOS General Interests Committee. So was it the Scottish Police Federation that initially raised concerns about the quality of the training?
I believe so, kind of around about 2006, 2007. And I think that was mainly in reference to there was no national probation or training programme, so each legacy force delivered OST independently.
I see.
And that's what, and it was at times markedly different. And I think that's where the Federation initially raised their concerns.
When was the National Probationers Programme introduced?
I believe it's 2008.
So prior to that, it would have been legacy forces who did the probationer training.
That's correct, yes. Just to clarify though, I mean, I've taken this background from source documents that I was able to find and identify, so I wasn't involved.
This isn't
in
from
this.
your personal
No,
recollection
no.
of events. Thank you. And then I think as we go down the page, it says in August 2008, a project mandate remit was submitted to ACPOS Personnel and Training Committee for consideration, and members subsequently approved the formation of the National OST Review Project as outlined above. Below is a summary of the recommendations that were subsequently agreed. This was a previous review, was it?
Yes.
So this was not your review,
No.
but you're simply narrating the history.
That's correct.
Can we move on to the next page, page 5, please? You say at the top, an equality impact assessment was completed in January 2010. So that was 4 years before you took over as National Coordinator. Was that in relation to the Equalities Act at the time?
I would suggest so, yes.
No evidence of who signed the project off or any documentation for the rationale for the chosen techniques can be found. So did you actually look to see where you've told us yesterday when you came into the role, the 2013 manual was already in existence, it had arrived the month before. Were you not able to find documentation about how that had been created, how the techniques had been selected, none of that?
No, I couldn't find any evidence or rationale or provenance as to why the content of that manual was as it was. Anecdotally, I understood where it came from, but as for any documentation, I couldn't find it.
Right. Then the next, if we move down the page, please. Do we see at the end of the next paragraph, you say, you're mentioning meetings, but you say there appeared to be no clear lines of communication and many practitioners were and are unaware of what was agreed. Many members of these groups have moved on and much of what was agreed was never implemented by legacy forces. So there seems to have been some difficulties with communication and uptake in relation to the previous review.
That's correct, yes.
And then you go on to sort of comment that although National Standardised Core Programme was developed and delivered to student police officers at Tullyallen, this core programme was not always replicated at the annual refreshers, with some legacy forces maintaining their own programmes and techniques. And this led to a disparity of approach to training and supporting processes. And that's exactly what you were telling us earlier today.
Yes.
There has been no national review since the programme was introduced and since the inception of Police Scotland. And you then say, you will see it in bold there towards the bottom, to ensure that police training is meeting the needs of the service, it should be regularly reviewed and evaluated at all levels to assess relevance, achievement and improve future effectiveness. And that comes from Police Scotland, the national model for quality assurance of training and education.
That's correct.
Is that a Police Scotland guidance document or?
It was at the time, yes.
Right. And so their own national model for quality assurance of their training and education programme did recommend regular reviews and evaluations.
Yes.
But those hadn't been done.
Not since 2007, 2008, no.
Thank you. Towards the bottom of page 5, you say during the transition to Police Scotland, most areas of business had a reform work stream, including public order and firearms training. You've mentioned that today. OST did not have its own reform work stream to review and standardise the programme. It became apparent that many areas of OST required to be reviewed to mitigate risks to personnel and, if we can move the page down, and the organisation to introduce an effective and standardised training programme and to maintain the organisation's focus of keeping people safe. So as much for the public as anyone else.
Very much so, yes.
So you've then entitled the National Officer Safety Training Review, which commenced on the 1st of December 2014 and continued, and we see there until the 1st of March 2015. And then you wrote your review and it was published in April that year. And you set out the aim of the review and you set out your terms of reference. And then over the following pages, I think you summarise your overview and give us a snapshot of the way things were in each of the different divisions. And you go through A division, C division, and you go right through. Could we look, please, at P Division, which is on page 14? And you then essentially, is this a snapshot of the training in P Division, one of the legacy forces,
Yes.
during the time you were doing your review?
Yes.
And you tell us they had 10 officer safety trainers. You say all are operational officers with the exception of one who is employed within TLD. What was that?
And that's training, leadership and development. So TLD is a national division responsible for mainly responsible for the training of the force. But within each division, you'll have an officer who is attached to TLD, but is mainly responsible for training in that particular division.
Right. And you say here P Division was previously assisted by trainers from OSD, but these have now been withdrawn by OSD. Can you explain some of that background?
So OSD's Operational Support Division, which is a national division, and prior to Police Scotland, if you were in a support role, whether it be a public order team or a firearms, or the division would be responsible for, you would be part of that division. The move to Police Scotland, all those specialist officers were taken into a national division, and the decision was made by the commander of that national division that they would not be delivering or allowing their officers to assist in the training of local divisions.
So they were taken in nationally,
Yes.
rather than dealing with each legacy force.
Yes.
And you've said there that there was no identified OST coordinator
No.
for P Division.
Correct.
So were these trainers not coordinated by any individual?
At that time, the training sergeant who was attached to the local training department had the ultimate responsibility of ensuring that there was sufficient instructors in place to meet the training demand, and he would then make the resource requests to have these officers abstracted from their local policing shift to assist with OST training as and when was required. But as far as programme, as far as, I suppose, that higher level coordination, then no.
Am I correct in saying that you said yesterday that some of the trainers were part-time, some were full-time?
Yes.
Do you remember in Fife Constabulary what the position was?
They are all part-time.
All part-time.
Yes.
And you've then gone on to say at that time there were no persons managing use of force or PERC. Explain some of the background there.
So prior to the formation of Police Scotland, each legacy force had its own processes, procedures for recording use of force. Obviously with the creation of Police Scotland and the subsequent creation of PERC, we had a statutory obligation, a requirement to report firearms discharges to PERC. So as of 2013, that responsibility was placed on the only full-time unit, full-time OST unit in Scotland, which was the Legacy Strathclyde unit. So they assumed a national responsibility for reporting all, at that time, CS discharges to the PERC.
I was going to say we've heard that for the purposes of classification, as discharging your CS spray counted as a firearm.
Comes a firearm
And
discharge.
that had to be reported to PERC
Yes.
within a certain period.
Yes,
And that came into force on the 1st of April 2013.
that's correct, yes.
That's great, thank you. And then you mentioned the training venue they had in Fife at Glenrothes. And if we can move further down the page, please. You say there were no set assessment criteria for students, there was no method in place to assess the competency of trainers, and there are no quality assurance processes in place. And that's specific to P Division, which covers Kirkcaldy.
Yeah, that's correct, yes, and that was replicated throughout the country, to be honest.
I mean, this is not an unusual picture for
No,
P Division.
no.
There were many issues like this.
Yes.
You say trainers use a mix of EDIP, problem solution teach method of training delivery. Could you explain that sentence, please?
So there are two teaching methods that can be employed. So EDIP is explain, demonstrate, imitate and practice, and problem solution teach is just a different teaching method. So in EDIP, the instructor would explain what the technique entails. That instructor would then demonstrate that technique to the students, they would then imitate that and then go away and practice that. Whereas with problem solution teach, it's just a different teaching method where, as opposed to explaining first, you would demonstrate what the problem is you are trying to overcome. You would then give them a solution, which would be the technique, and then they would go and practice.
And
There was a mix of that in P Division, because EDIP was the teaching method employed by Lothian and Borders Police, and Problem Solution Teach was the teaching method employed by Scottish Police College. So prior to Police Scotland, if you did your OST instructors course delivered by the senior instructors from Lothian and Borders, they would teach you in EDIP. But if you did your instructors course at the Scottish Police College, you'd have been instructed to deliver problem solution.
right. And I'm wondering if that was confusing slightly for the students, or did it not make much difference?
It was confusing, yes. Yep.
And none of those methods involve scenario training like you've described?
No.
And then you say officers apply the techniques to compliant subjects only. Explain the impact of that.
So when you are, in particularly with a control and restraint, an empty hand technique, the health and safety of the officers is paramount, and the minimising injury. So therefore, if you are practising on your colleague, they will be compliant, they won't resist, they won't put up a level of resistance. Because if they put up a level of resistance, the use of force might have to be greater and the injury potential increases. So whilst you could be technically proficient, it's not realistic. And that's one of the drawbacks and challenges of this type of training activity.
Were there question marks over how effective that would make the officer in a real life situation?
Exactly.
Thank you. And then you say that P Division follows the current Tully Allen programme for annual recertification, although differences in techniques taught have been observed. I think you mentioned that earlier, that there were, you described significant differences in some ways, but you've noticed there that there are differences in some of the techniques. Yes. Do you remember any of them that were different?
I wouldn't be able to say with any certainty now.
All right. You say they use a generic safety briefing. What's the significance of that?
So we found that, I found that there was different safety briefings being utilised at different legacy forces. But there is a generic safety brief that's used at the Scottish Police College for probationer training. And if I've said this, that would mean that P Division would use that safety briefing.
So at least in that extent, to that extent, they were consistent with Tully Allen.
Yes, and as far as my memory goes, P Division were generally one of the more compliant divisions when it came to teaching the same core techniques as were taught at Tully Allen.
Right. You've mentioned the Glenrothes is risk assessed. You've talked about that earlier. And you say P Division uses its own version of assessment and course return forms. Was that of any concern?
No. It was good to see that they did use a course return form. It was good to see that they did use an assessment checklist. But again, it just differed slightly.
Right.
And it just, again, I kind of suppose interfered with that consistency.
Thank you. You say police officers receive 8 hours learning contact time per annum. What does that mean, learning contact time?
So that's the amount of hours they will receive for their annual refresher training.
Right. And then you mentioned more senior officers, so I won't go into that. Can we move on to the next page, page 15, please? It says special constables receive a 4-day course and thereafter annual recertification. PCSOs receive a 4-day course and thereafter annual recertification. Can you give us a little bit more explanation of that?
In relation to the special constables or in relation to PCSO?
Yes,
Or both?
They both appear to deal with a 4-day course.
Yeah.
Was it the same course? I think yesterday you said it was the same course.
It became the same course. Back then, I believe it was... Yeah, that was the issue, was that if you... The training provided to probationers was a 5-day course, and special constables and PCSOs at that time received a slightly shortened abbreviated course, which didn't include all the content, which again we are identified as a risk. It has to be consistent across the board because they face the same risks.
Sorry, I should have asked you to explain what PCSO is.
So that's a police custody and security officer, a civilian member of staff who would work in the custody environment, looking after the care and welfare of custodies.
But yesterday we talked about PC McDonough, who became, initially was a special constable.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of course he would have had at Fife Constabulary, a 4-day special constable's course.
I would assume so, yes.
And then you talk about some equipment that's delivered, and then you move on to the V division. I won't ask you to look at that. Can I then ask you to go on to page 17, please? And this talks about evaluation methodology. Consultation was carried out with the Quality Assurance Unit at PSC Tullyallen to develop the most appropriate method of programme evaluation. Now, I think you said earlier you hadn't been trained in carrying out reviews, but you saw the necessity to do one, and you volunteered to do that in your role. So why were you looking for an appropriate method of evaluation?
Just for the reasons that you mentioned, I had never conducted a review of this before. Whilst I had, at that time, I believe I had completed my diploma in training, so I knew about how to conduct programme evaluation. For me, it's best practice to approach and get advice from experts who that's their job, is to carry out programme evaluations.
And so you went to the Quality Assurance Unit to get their advice. Was that before you started?
That's correct.
The process?
Obviously, I wanted the evaluation to be robust, and yeah.
And you said that during the evaluation period, 5 main evaluation methods were employed, and you list those. Could you talk the chair through those, please?
Yeah, of course. So evaluation questionnaires. Again, with the assistance of the Quality Assurance Unit, we produced questionnaires that were sent out to, I think, around over 2,000 officers. And we utilised one of the Quality Assurance staff to analyse that data and put it into a format that could be understood. We reviewed and gathered the data from all use of force forms that were submitted during the evaluation period. We conducted focus groups, so during OST training, we would gather officers aside and ask them a series of questions, and that enabled us to get, I suppose, more context, more information than what's contained in evaluation forms. We visited divisions, to response shifts, etc., and spoke to officers there. The benchmarking aspect was obviously what we discussed before, was speaking to colleagues in the rest of the UK. And the divisional approach, was as part of the focus group, I suppose, was the divisional approach was we looked at what each division was doing and we spoke to officers within the respective divisions.
So a lot of research done by you under those 5 methods. And then you go on to say, if we move down the page, evaluation questionnaires, you say that they were sent to officer safety trainers, operational officers and probationers, student police officers. Yes. So it wasn't just simply one group that you sought data from?
No.
And you've detailed those in Appendix B, if the Chair wishes to look at those in more detail. And you say that each level of user was asked to provide opinions on the programme, what techniques they used operationally. Does that mean in their sort of day-to-day work?
Yes.
What techniques they felt were too difficult or complicated, what techniques they preferred, how the programme could be improved, and what were the 4 most important aspects of the programme. Was that in relation to the sort of techniques and strategies they used in their day-to-day work?
That's correct, yeah.
And you contained the results of that in Appendix C to your review. Can we turn on to the next page, please? Use of force forms. And it says all use of force forms submitted nationally during the evaluation period were interrogated and the results noted. In total, 422 use of force forms were submitted during the evaluation period. And you've given a breakdown of the techniques used in Appendix D. We have heard some evidence about use of force forms and use of spray forms, and a suggestion has been made that maybe it was slightly erratic, the completion of these. Could you tell us about your experience when you were trying to gather in the data?
So going back to the Legacy Force days, there was again that disparate approach to submitting use of force forms, recording use of force data. Some areas just didn't record it. Others, it was, as you say, it was sparse, varied. So that's not a big data set. That's a small data set for me. Only 422 forms during that evaluation period. Again, that was one of the aspects that we needed to look at, was how do we ensure that officers are submitting use of force forms when they should be.
Were you endeavouring to recover all of the use of force forms throughout the whole of Police Scotland?
Yeah, at this time I think, maybe with the exception of 1 or 2 forces, all had moved on to the submission of use of force forms on scope.
Right, we've heard of that. Now, the review period started on the 1st of December 2014 and finished at the end of March, or in March, 1st of March 2015. You've said that's a low number. What would you have expected if every officer who uses force on a shift is genuinely completing a use of force form?
For me, that should have been in the thousands, well into the thousands.
But you only recovered 422?
Again, I can't exactly remember, but I think either 1 or 2 forces either didn't record use of force data or didn't record it in a format that could be recovered, or it was in a format that it would have taken months to extract all that data. So this was only the use of force forms on scope. But yeah, it's a, for me it was a shockingly low number.
Do you remember what the position was in relation to the former Fife Legacy Force?
No, I don't think they utilised scope prior to, obviously, Police Scotland, and I don't know when they transitioned to scope. I think they still used paper copies and it was collated, but again, if I remember, P Division or Legacy Fife didn't have anybody to manage these these forms.
Thank you. Can we move on to focus groups, please? In addition to the 1287 evaluation forms completed, 282 officers took part in small focus groups. These consisted of operational officers spoken to during their annual recertification or during their operational tour of duty. I think you mentioned that just a moment ago. And they were asked similar questions to the evaluation forms and their opinions noted, and you've collated those in Appendix E. And then the benchmarking exercise. You say a number of police forces in England were contacted and spoken to at length. Details of their programmes and processes were obtained, and you've listed there the forces those forces that you personally contacted.
Yes.
As part of the review, and it included the Met.
Yes,
And it also included College of Policing.
that's correct.
Thank you. Just keep moving down, please. And you say you also approached the Scottish Prison Service and they provided details of their programme.
Yes.
And what was the benefit of speaking to the Scottish Prison Service?
So obviously the Scottish Prison Service have a control and restraint element to their role, and obviously they have to be trained, and so I was very interested to see, what their setup was, what their governance processes were, what they trained, how they trained, why they trained.
And was that markedly different to the programme you had in place at the time?
It was different in the respect that they operate in a different environment, and most times it's a very confined environment the prison service operate in. So their techniques were, a lot, from my recollection, were aimed at that type of environment. It differed. Some of their techniques differed significantly to ours, but again, that's usually because of the reason of the operating environment.
Thank you. And then we can turn to page 19. You move on to the summary of evaluation process, and you talk about a breakdown of the statistics, and you mention the appendices, and you talk about evaluation questionnaires and focus groups. And you said the main finding from the questionnaires was that the current programme delivered at divisions varied from area to area. Differing approaches to training delivery were evident, with some techniques that are contained in the manual at Tullyallen not being taught, and other techniques which are not in the manual being taught. So in fact, some of the techniques were simply missed out completely.
Yes.
For those doing refresher training,
Yes.
or formerly legacy force probationer training.
Yes.
And you've given some quotes, I think, from some of the questionnaires there. And you say then, if we move down the page, the most important aspect of OST, and you give the 4 most important, if we can move down slightly. Handcuffing, basic empty hand techniques, basic hold and restraints, 2 or 3 person teams. Can you help us understand what those are? Obviously, a handcuffing speaks for itself.
So basic empty hand techniques are your blocks, your strikes, and then basic holds and restraints are the various different types of holds and restraints that we, so come along holds, straight arm bars, etc. Those techniques are used to restrain an individual. 2 and 3 person teams is what's now known as, or what is now known as violent prisoner tactics, and that is where you have to restrain an individual who has been assaultive or violent to place them into a police cell.
So in terms of officer safety training, the most important techniques were all 4 of those relate to use of force.
Yes.
So they were considered the most significant in terms of the responses you got from the questionnaires.
Yes.
There's no mention there of communication or de-escalation or any of that. That wasn't considered one of the most significant.
not that. So this is simply based on the responses from the officers. But to be fair, I already had that in hand because that was coming in. That was going to be improved. But it was, I suppose, disappointing to see that wasn't high up in the list of priorities for me.
And when we say most important, was that a reflection of what they used most often, or what they considered most significant, or perhaps they're the same things?
I think anecdotally for me, it's because the programme had always been focused on these types of techniques that maybe I didn't explain the evaluation properly, and they would, and the officers involved in the evaluation assumed that it was simple to do with the techniques and what techniques they. So maybe it may be the nuance of the wording that was in the evaluation report.
Thank you. But then you note that in terms of the questionnaires that were returned, they felt that OST was given a low priority by managers, which I think you've talked about already, but many also viewed this training as boring, irrelevant and a necessary bind. And I mentioned to you earlier, there's sort of negative slant on some of the responses.
Yes.
Could we move on to the next page, please? Page 20. We see here trainers reported back that there was insufficient training material to assist them in delivering effective training. Can you give us a little bit more detail about that?
So that was in reference to the fact that there were no lesson plans. There was nothing to instruct the trainers on, I suppose, the minute by minute, hour by hour structure and what should be delivered, how it should be delivered, the aims, the learning outcomes, how they're going to be achieved. So basically the instructors had the manual, they had a checklist, and they felt it was basically down to them how they delivered it and what order they delivered it. And again, that's got its advantages, but it's also got its disadvantages.
So that was something that trainers, when they responded, expressed concern
Yes.
about. And I think you've already talked to us about different trainers having different styles
Yes.
and methods. You say these findings were consistent with the evaluation forms submitted by all level of user and focus groups. So was there consistency across the board in relation to the use of training materials?
Yes, that was mainly in relation to access to the information that they required. So as I believe I spoke about yesterday, there was no access to the manual at that time unless you had a hard copy lying about somewhere. And some of the responses were in relation to, well, if I've used force and I'm required to write a statement, I want to make sure it's consistent with the training within the manual, but I can't access the manual to reference back.
Right. Moving on to use of force forms, you talk about the results from those were compiled. As anticipated, the majority of use of force related to handcuffing, with 94% of all forms involving handcuffing techniques. The following breaks down the percentage of use of force forms utilising the remaining techniques within the programme. And then you give, I appreciate what you said about the number of forms that you had at your disposal, but then we can see the different references, and there are, if we move down the page, you'll see all of them. And again, equally, it appears that holds and restraints and fast trap are by far the greatest number that are used, and CS and PAVA, and to some extent baton, are next on the list. Takedowns, is that when someone's brought down to the ground?
Yes.
All right, thank you. And it says, the next paragraph, if we can look at that, a possible issue with these results was a disparity of approach as to when a use of force form should be submitted. Submission procedures varied between divisions, with many officers uncertain as to the circumstances of when a use of form should be submitted. Can you give us a little bit more explanation of that?
Each legacy force had, I suppose, different criteria for when an officer should submit a use of force form. So, for example, Legacy Strathclyde was you had to submit a use of force form for any use of force with the exception of compliant handcuffing. So that's when you don't actually have to use force to handcuff someone. They are happy, if you want to use it, to be handcuffed. They don't offer any resistance. Others, it was only if certain uses of force were utilised. Others, if it was only if there was an injury. And others didn't. And many of the officers that I spoke to really weren't sure of when they would submit a use of force form or not. So that was a priority. Yeah.
I mean, was there any training about that, standardised national training at that time?
No.
Moving on to benchmarking, you see this was carried out with English and non-Home Office forces as outlined above. And that's both English forces like the Met and other non-Home Office. They're two separate things.
Yes.
All of these forces use the ACPO Personal Safety Training Manual of Guidance. You've mentioned that. This manual outlines a number of prescribed agreed techniques, with each force choosing which techniques are more relevant to their operational needs. So did there seem to be some difference between different forces in England and Wales as well at that time?
So the difference in England and Wales was that they had, I suppose, a toolbox of techniques. So they had an approved number of techniques, and it was then down to each individual force to decide, I suppose, based on their own demand profile, what techniques they would use in their force. But if the advantage of that is that whatever technique they chose, it's an approved, recognised, quality assured technique. So if 10 forces decide they wanted to use a technique, or technique number A, or technique A, sorry, that technique would be exactly the same in all 10 forces.
That wasn't the position in Scotland with the legacy forces?
No.
They didn't have a toolbox as such, a national agreed standard?
No.
Thank you. You then say these forces all use the SPEAR system. Can you explain what that was?
The SPEAR system is basically a self-defence system. It's not a martial art, but it's a method of self-defence. It's a private company who have created this SPEAR system, and that was taken on by ACPOS as their primary self-defence system.
ACPO guidance is for 12 hours PST training per annum. We may hear next year from Martin Graves that was the sort of national guidance was 12 hours a year. What were they doing in Scotland at that time?
So ours was an 8-hour shift, but if you take out the breaks, you have to, give the officers. We were talking maybe 6.5 hours contact time.
Right. And then it goes on to say the forces benchmarked it adhered to this guidance, but a number of other forces do not. So does that mean the ones you'd listed did adhere to that guidance?
I can't remember exactly. I just know that at that time, that 12 hours minimum contact time was a recommendation and it wasn't a mandatory requirement.
Right. I think you go on to say that it was guidance only at present, but steps were being taken to make this training contact time mandatory.
Yes.
Each force benchmarked had a centralised team with lead instructors responsible for policy training and compliance. Most utilised full-time trainers. Within England and Wales, there is a high priority given to personal safety training, with the ACPO self-defence, arrest and restraint group meeting regularly. What was your view about that approach taken down in England and Wales compared to the position in Scotland?
When I first got introduced to the ACPO self-defence, arrest and restraint group and was exposed to what they were doing, I thought there was quite a stark difference in terms of the robust governance, the priority provided, given to personal safety training, their structures, their management, their governance. I think it was potentially in stark contrast to what we had. I felt we had, I suppose, quite a kind of ad hoc kind of approach, which needed to be formalised, and I suppose, reflect what they have in the rest of the UK.
And was what they were doing in England more in line with what you were hoping to achieve?
Absolutely, yes.
As part of your review?
Yes.
You say there was a recognised national programme operated in conjunction with the College of Policing, who outlined minimal requirements for PST trainers and adherence to national occupational standards. We've heard a number of things about the College of Policing. What was your experience of the work that they were doing?
I thought the work they were doing was very good. What the College of Policing gives you is that top cover. If they produce a training package, then you know it's fully quality assured, it's fully researched, and governed, so it will stand up to scrutiny. I just didn't think ours at that time would potentially stand up to scrutiny, and the College of Policing have more resources at hand. They have identified staff for their various portfolios, who work out with the forces in England and Wales, who are there to support those forces in England and Wales. And it's really the first time I had come into contact or had any exposure to the College of Policing, and taken from where we were, I was very impressed with the work that they did.
Thank you. You then say the forces benchmarked all deliver some form of PST training to all police officers and police staff who may come into contact with the public. All venues and techniques are subject to regular risk assessment processes. And I'm interested to read there that it's not just the venues that had the risk assessment there, but you say the techniques are subject to regular risk assessment. And was that something that you noted about England and Wales?
Yes, as I say, that's all part, I suppose, of their more established and robust processes. At that time, I think it was only Legacy Strathclyde, I think, who had risk assessed the techniques and the potential impact on the community, or members of the public, and those who those techniques are being employed on. And that's something that I really wanted to ensure we had in place.
Thank you. Let's move on to section 5 of your review and report, summary of review findings. And you set out the introduction, and then the main findings are given. And you talk, we'll go through these, if I may, supporting processes. And you've given a number of bullet points. You say that there's a lack of a standardised approach, which we've talked about already. If we can move on to the next page. You talk about disparity of approaches and standards, no centralised unit to monitor compliance and develop policy, no QA, differences in administration processes, no standardised approach to processes, including forms, assessment methods, programme content, training delivery methods, or management of use of force and perk. And no standardised risk assessments in place for techniques and venues, lack of supporting documentation and guidance, ongoing issue with trainers. What does it mean not being released by RMUs, leading to a shortage of trainers?
So, excuse me, an RMU is a resource management unit. The resource management units are responsible for ensuring that at any particular time there are sufficient officers on duty. And the resource management units are responsible for abstracting officers to training courses, cognizant of the bigger picture of the operational demand. And at times we were trying to deliver OST training using the part-time divisional instructors, and we would say, well, we need to put on X amount of courses, need to go in these days, and the RMUs or divisional management would say, well, we can't release those officers due to operational demand. So it was that, I suppose, that constant challenge in trying to balance ensuring that the divisions had sufficient officers to meet their operational demand, but also to deliver the training. And that's the problem with having part-time instructors. When you don't own them, you can't deploy them as you see fit.
So we've heard that Fife used, the former Legacy Force used part-time
Yeah.
trainers. Are you aware of how often that situation with lack of resourcing occurred?
When I moved down to Jackton and took over the national coordination, I don't know, I can't speak specifically for P Division, but it was an ongoing issue. You know, you would put a course on, allocate to instructors, and then you would receive notification from the IRMUs that they're removing one of the instructors, and then you have to. So it was an ongoing challenge for me to ensure that we had sufficient resources.
And would that involve courses being cancelled?
The courses were cancelled due to that, yes.
And so managing to give annual refresher training to all the officers that needed refreshed, would that prove to be a difficulty?
It was, yes.
And then you say training delivery to police staff differs from division to division. Is that non-serving officers? But
That's mainly in relation to police custody and security officers.
right. Thank you. You said there was no recognised communication strategy. You've mentioned that. Difficulties experienced in communicating with trainers, administrators, divisional management and divisional officers on a national level. So it appears from your summary of these supporting processes that there were a number of areas where difficulties existed and were continuing in relation to the provision of OST to officers.
Yes,
That's something.
yes.
And then you then go on to talk about the programme itself. And the first thing you say there on page 22, there are too many techniques contained within the programme with not enough time to learn these to an acceptable level. And I think you mentioned that was, did you have 80 something techniques?
I think it was 82 or 84, I think, from memory.
And officers were being given seconds, really 30 seconds to try and train on a technique. And was that enough time for anyone to learn a technique properly?
Absolutely not, no.
Do you have, I mean, I imagine some techniques are more complicated than others. How much time would you wish to give either a probationer or a serving officer time? How much time would you like them to have?
It's an extremely difficult question to answer. I mean, each person has their own abilities, their own skill levels, their own levels of coordination, fitness. I suppose a way to assess that is when you deliver your teaching in the, at the beginning, and as they progress through that training event, you should set an assessment criteria, an assessment level, and that's your way to gauge if that officer's learned, what you have taught them to an acceptable level. And if they don't get there, then they may need remedial development training. So it's difficult to say how long each technique should be, because officers may learn it very quickly and reach that level of assessment that they should get.
So is that assessment made depending on the participants of each course? Or do you work towards an average officer or some other standard, the least experienced, least stable officer?
No, so an OST, unfortunately, as we refer to it as the lowest common denominator, we have to, it's not for the assessment level, but how we teach has to be to those with potentially the least amount of skill, least amount of knowledge, least amount of coordination, etc. And at times that can hold others who are more proficient back a bit. But as far as the assessment's concerned, you look at your aims and learn outcomes of your training event, and an assessment should be how can you judge if those officers have met those aims and learning outcomes. So if you're going to teach someone how to, suppose, use a baton, that'd be one of your learning outcomes at the end of this training you will be able to strike with a baton, your assessment has to be something that's related to that learning outcome. So your assessment could be you can have them stand up and you watch them demonstrate baton use.
Right. And then as we move on to page 23, you talk about many of the techniques are overly complicated and are never used operationally. The programme isn't sufficiently operationally relevant, insufficient time to learn core techniques, not enough emphasis placed on the techniques that are used most frequently, no vehicle techniques, vehicle removal, placing, removing suspects, dealing with suspects. Would that include using a vehicle as a means of creating distance between covering yourself or protecting yourself?
No. Not in this context, no.
No. And then you talk about the most important aspects and say that although there are disparities, the following are standard approaches, and you give those details if we move down the page. It's all of them have a 1:8 trainer-student ratio. They all deliver OST theory as per the Tully-Allen manual, and the majority of basic techniques are taught similarly, if not exactly the same. You made contact with the Health and Safety and Professional Standards Department, but there were no statistics available on officer assaults or complaints in relation to use of force. And you said it is strongly felt that OST is given a low priority, not only by many senior officers, but divisional officers also. And no other area within the training function trains every police officer and other staff initially and annually, and with most officers using these skills many times per day. So that's really what we're talking about here, isn't it? It's every single police officer who is sent out to deal with the public will have had some sort of OST training, and they will be using that every single time they're out on shift.
Yeah, the likelihood is high, yes.
And then I think on page 24 you talk about the risks to the public, the staff and the organisation if OST is not properly applied, and you focus there on keeping people safe. You put that in quotation marks, speech marks. What's keeping people safe?
So that was it's not a motto, but that was the corporate brand of that. That was Police Scotland's aim or objective.
Right.
Yeah.
And you talk about the importance of OST must be raised, and the possible risks to the public, staff and organisation if incorrectly and poorly applied officer safety training must be mitigated. So you recognise that risk in this review.
Yes.
And then you detail your recommendations, of which there are 28.
Yes.
And the chair will be able to look through those in detail. Again, I think there's an emphasis on you would like to achieve standardisation. You would like to bring the administration and the paperwork into a consistent approach across Scotland. Can we look at recommendation 3, please? And you talk specifically about following training evaluation, programme design and agreement to implement supporting processes, the National Use of Force SOP and Officer Safety SOP be reviewed and updated to ensure standardisation of approach and a current point of reference for all Police Scotland employees. And I'm interested in the relationship between what we've heard as standard operating procedures, of which there are many in the police, and the actual training manual. Was that something you felt that needed to be improved, the consistency between the two of those?
So a standard operating procedure should only provide direct instruction, and any information that's contained elsewhere shouldn't really be in a standard operating procedure. So what we found when I reviewed the use of force SOP, I found that the existing SOP was contained loads and loads from the manual, which shouldn't be in there, because the SOP is about direct instruction around about policies, procedures, etc. So anything that's contained within the training manual shouldn't really be in the SOP. And I think that's a misconception around about SOPs, in that they should have every piece of information available. But if that information is contained elsewhere, and that's a more appropriate place for it to be, then that's where it should be. So if it relates to training, then it shouldn't really be in the SOP, it should be in the training manual.
So did you want to rationalise the SOP for use of force and the manual so that the training information was in the manual, the direct instructions were in the use of force
Yes.
SOP
With links,
with links?
yes.
And would that then become available to officers on the intranet?
That's correct, yes.
Was the use of force SOP already available to officers on the intranet at that time?
I would imagine it would be, but I couldn't say for definite.
Thank you. And then we see at recommendation 4, you talk about there should be national guidance on use of force forms, and that should be introduced. And was that to improve the situation which you'd discovered about effectively the lack of use of force forms that you were able to recover?
Yes.
And then recommendation 5, a more operationally relevant focused approach is implemented into OST. And what was your intention by recommending this?
So that's when I wanted to introduce more around scenario-based training, de-escalation, conflict resolution, dealing with vulnerable people, and tactics. And I know that's a lot in 2 lines of a recommendation, but that was always meant to be, once we had our policies, our procedures, our standardisation and consistency in place, then we would look at, you know, some at times potentially radical improvements, as we hoped, to the programme.
And did you feel that those skills, de-escalation, communication, would be more operationally relevant for officers?
Absolutely.
Looking at recommendation 6, I'm interested in the final line of that as we go down. It says this new programme will then be subject to an equality impact assessment. It's just the last line of that. You say in your statement to the inquiry, no one had told you there needed to be an equality impact assessment done. Can you tell us a little more about that?
So the quality impact, the advice of the information I got was that a quality impact assessment should only be done in relation to a policy or a SOP. And I have to admit I was very naive in my understanding of equality impact assessments back then. And the only reason that I undertook a quality impact assessment was because I was directed to, because I had reviewed the use of force SOP. So the use of force SOP required an EQHRI or an EIA, which I didn't realise had to include the programme as well. And once I got that guidance, then we could move forward with the EIA. But that took a while for me to get my understanding to a level where it should have been.
How did you ultimately get that understanding?
I contacted our Equality and Diversity unit, and I suppose received a crash course in how to complete and undertake an EIA.
So when you say you contacted them, was that sort of proactive steps that you took to find out more?
Yes.
Had you been offered that assistance previously?
No.
Let's look, please, at recommendation 10. I think one of this suggests, you say it is proposed that a DVD be produced showing the teaching of all techniques with a breakdown of component parts of the techniques. Was this something that you thought would improve the training if there were actual consistent, well, videos that could be played?
Yes. What we found was that at times some of the divisional instructors may only be delivering 4 or 5 courses throughout the year, so they experienced a similar skill fade to the students. And I was in regular contact with many instructors who would tell me that they were quite nervous about coming back and delivering an OST course because of the passage of time between the delivered at the last time. So I intended to produce a DVD which would show how those techniques should be delivered, how they should be taught, and that would aid as an aid memoir for the instructors when it was time for them to come back and deliver the refresher training.
Thank you. And without going through all of the recommendations in turn, I think many talk about how you would like to see consistency achieved, standardisation, improved training for trainers, improved engagement generally with the training, and prioritising the training, assessing whether it had been done well and whether officers had engaged fully with it.
Yes.
Is that a fair summary of
Yes.
your recommendations? Thank you. And they're all listed with the appendices at the rear of this review. I was going to briefly go back and just ask, I'd touched on some of the organisations or groups that arising out of your review, and I am interested in moving on to what happened after you completed your review. But if we could just complete the reference to the groups that you were on. We'd touched on the use of force monitoring group, and you explained that this arose after the review. So can you tell us a little bit about that group and what its purpose, what was it designed to achieve?
So the use of force monitoring group came from the Officer Safety Training Monitoring Group. And for me it was imperative that we had that formalised, visible governance structure in place, that decision-making ability to provide scrutiny to the programme, to bring in stakeholders, partners within the organisation who could advise, and make the product the best it could be. So that collective, I suppose, views and opinions, and things I would maybe never have heard, have considered, but also within the police it gives that top cover, it gives that approval process, so that and that decision-making process. And I think that's the kind of main terms of reference of that group, was to provide that governance structure, that decision-making process in relation to changes, in relation to issues or challenges that were identified.
Well, I'd like to ask you some further questions about the work that they did. I'm conscious of the time now.
Yes, well, we'll stop for lunch at 2 o'clock.
Thank you.